The sawdust danced in the slivers of morning light that cut through the garage window. Each particle a tiny ghost of a tree that had once stood tall. Jack Wilson sat on a worn stool, his back aching with a familiar complaint, his hands moving with a grace that belied their calloused texture. He was carving a bird, a small finch with wings half spread, as if caught in a moment of decision to stay or to fly. The wood was maple, smooth and pale, and smelled of cold earth and new beginnings. He'd found the fallen branch in the woods behind their small rented house in Mapleton, a gift from a storm that had passed through last week. His daughter Emma sat on the floor nearby, a stack of books forming a wobbly throne beside her. She was 7, with eyes that held the quiet depth of an old soul and a laugh that could shatter the thickest silence. She wasn't watching him, not directly, but he could feel her presence like a low, steady hum, the anchor in the choppy waters of his life. She was coloring, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth in concentration as she filled a page with a swirl of impossible blues and greens. He glanced at the half-finished finch in his hands, its head tilted with a curious, almost hopeful expression he hadn't intended to carve. It was her favorite. She'd named it Finch. "Is Finch ready to see the world, Daddy?" she'd asked him last night, her small fingers tracing the unfinished curve of its wing. He had smiled, a tired thing that didn't quite reach his eyes, and said, "Almost, Pumpkin. He's just a little shy." The truth was, Jack was the one who was shy. Shy of the numbers that screamed at him from the stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter. The one with the red border from the landlord was the loudest. Rent due, final notice. Words that felt like stones in his throat. He lost his job at Craftsman Furniture 3 months ago when they downsized, shipping the work overseas to a place where hands were cheaper and dreams were smaller. Since then, he'd been surviving on the whispers of odd jobs, a broken fence here, a wobbly bookshelf there, and the small, intricate wooden toys he carved in this garage. They were beautiful things, animals mostly, each one with a personality that seemed to emerge from the grain itself. But beauty didn't pay the bills. He ran his thumb over the finch's back, feeling the smooth, perfect grain. He had to sell it. He had to sell all of them. The thought was a cold weight in his chest. These weren't just toys, they were stories, pieces of a life he was trying to hold together with wood glue and hope. Each one was a conversation he'd had with Emma, a memory of a walk in the woods, a quiet afternoon spent in the shared sanctuary of this dusty garage. Selling them felt like selling off pieces of their history, one small animal at a time. He looked over at Emma again. She was humming now, a tune with no beginning and no end. She didn't know about the red envelope. She didn't know the pantry was down to a half-empty bag of rice and a few cans of beans. She just knew her dad could make magic out of wood, that he could make birds that looked like they might sing. He set the finch down carefully, picked up a fine grit sandpaper, and began to smooth its edges. His movements slow and deliberate. He would make it perfect. It was the least he could do for a piece of his heart he was about to give away. The decision had settled in his chest overnight, a cold, hard knot that wouldn't dissolve with the morning coffee he couldn't afford to brew. He had to go to the market. The Saturday Oak Grove Artisan Fair in the town square was a bustling, chaotic place filled with potters, painters, and women who crocheted hats that looked like vegetables. It wasn't his world. His world was the quiet scent of cedar shavings, the patient rasp of a file against wood, the solitary focus of bringing something to life with his own 2 hands. But the world of the market, the world of commerce and cash boxes and polite smiles, was the one that held the key to keeping the lights on for another week, to keeping the red-bordered envelope from turning into an eviction notice. He told Emma over breakfast 2 slices of toast with the last scrape of jam shared between them. He explained it carefully, his voice low and steady, trying to keep the tremor of his own fear from bleeding into his words. He said they were going to have an adventure, that they were going to show everyone the beautiful animals he'd made. He didn't say it was because they were out of options. He didn't say it was because his pride, the thing he'd guarded so fiercely since Rebecca was gone, had finally worn thin enough to see through. She looked at him, her dark eyes unblinking, her toast held halfway to her mouth. She glanced at the shelf by the door where the small wooden menagerie lived. The fox with the sly grin, the lumbering bear, the timid deer, and Finch the little finch who now sat finished and gleaming. All of them, she asked, her voice small. Jack nodded, his own throat tight. Just for a little while, he lied, and the lie tasted like ash. We're going to find them new homes where they can have new adventures. She was quiet for a long moment, and he braced himself for tears, for the kind of childhood protest he wouldn't have the strength to counter. But Emma was different. She had been born with a quiet resilience, a way of understanding the things he couldn't bring himself to say. She finished her toast, hopped off her chair, and walked over to the shelf. She picked up Finch, holding the small wooden bird in both hands. She whispered something to it, too quiet for him to hear. Then she kissed its head and placed it carefully into the worn cardboard box he'd set by the door. "Okay, Daddy," she said, turning back to him with a wobbly but determined smile. "Let's find them a good home." And in that moment, Jack felt a surge of love so fierce it almost brought him to his knees. It was a love tangled with a profound and aching guilt. He was her father, her protector, the one who was supposed to build a world where she never had to be brave, where her favorite toys didn't have price tags, but the world he had built was cracked and leaning, and he was asking his 7-year-old daughter to help him hold it up. He knelt and pulled her into a hug, burying his face in her hair, which smelled faintly of sunshine and sleep. "You're the best kid in the whole world," he whispered. She squeezed him back, her small arms a lifeline. "I know," she said. And for the first time that day, his smile was real. They would go to the market. They would face the crowds and the noise and the indifference. They would do it together. The old truck groaned in protest as Jack turned the key, the engine catching with a rattling cough that sounded like it was clearing its throat of a long-held complaint. The check engine light had been on for 6 months, a constant, glowing reminder of a problem he knew how to fix but couldn't afford the parts for. It was a cruel irony for a man who spent his life mending things. He loaded the boxes of wooden toys into the truck bed, each one packed with old newspaper to keep them from chipping. He handled the boxes with a reverence that felt more like he was transporting relics than inventory. Emma sat in the passenger seat, buckled in with Finch, the Finch clutched in her lap. She had insisted on carrying him herself, a silent, solemn guardian of their most precious cargo. When they arrived at the town square, the market was already a kaleidoscope of color and sound. Tents of every shade dotted the green. Vendors shouted greetings, and the air was thick with the competing smells of kettle corn, lavender soap, and grilling sausages. Jack found his assigned spot at the far edge of the lawn, a small forgotten patch of grass next to a gnarled oak tree. Away from the main flow of foot traffic, he unfolded his wobbly card table, the one he'd found on the curb last year, and draped it with a faded blue bed sheet. He arranged the toys with meticulous care, creating a small enchanted forest on the worn fabric. The fox peered out from behind the bear, the squirrel perched on a makeshift branch, and the deer stood poised as if listening for a distant sound. They looked beautiful, out of place, like wild things captured and put on display. He'd made the signs himself last night, hand-lettered on scraps of cardboard, hand-carved wooden animals made with love. He didn't list a price, hoping to engage people in conversation, hoping they'd see the story in the grain before they saw the number on the tag. Emma helped, her small hands arranging acorns and pine cones around the display, her seriousness a stark contrast to the festival atmosphere around them. As the morning wore on, a slow parade of people drifted past. They'd slow down, their eyes catching on the miniature world he'd created. "Oh, how charming," a woman in a wide-brimmed hat would murmur before being pulled away by her husband toward a stall selling brightly colored glass beads. A young couple would stop, pick up the bear, feel its weight in their hands. "This is incredible," the man would say, "the craftsmanship." But then they'd see the unwritten price in Jack's tired eyes, the quiet desperation he was trying so hard to hide, and they would set it down gently, offer a polite smile, and move on. Each time it happened, a small piece of Jack's carefully constructed hope chipped away. He tried to smile, to engage, to tell them about the wood, about the hours spent with a knife and a piece of his soul. But the words felt hollow in the noisy air. He felt invisible, his quiet craft drowned out by the louder, shinier, cheaper things that surrounded him. He was a whisper in a room full of shouts. Emma seemed to feel it, too. She had started the day with a bright, hopeful energy. But now she sat quietly on an overturned crate behind the table, her chin resting in her hands, watching the river of people flow past without stopping. He wanted to tell her it was okay, that they could pack up and go home, but he couldn't. The red-bordered envelope was waiting. He had to stay. He had to keep trying. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the back of Jack's neck. The initial trickle of market-goers had turned into a steady stream, a river of faces that flowed past his stall with a frustrating and consistent lack of interest. He had adjusted the display 3 times, repositioning the little wooden owl to catch the light, turning the fox to showcase its most cunning angle. Nothing worked. The world, it seemed, was in a hurry, and his quiet, patient craft belonged to a slower time. He sold one piece, a small, simple fish that a grandfather bought for his grandson. Jack had asked for $10. The man had handed him a 5 and said, "It's for a kid. He'll probably lose it anyway." Jack had taken the $5, the crumpled bill, feeling like both a victory and a profound defeat. His stomach growled, a low, embarrassing rumble. He hadn't eaten, wanting to save the last of the bread for Emma's lunch. He watched her now, her small form slumped on the crate. The initial excitement of the day had long since evaporated, replaced by the quiet boredom of a child who had been promised an adventure and had been given a lesson in invisibility instead. He reached into their bag and pulled out the sandwich he'd made for her, along with a juice box. Her face lit up, a small, temporary sunbeam in the gloom of the afternoon. "Thanks, Daddy," she mumbled, her mouth already full. As she ate, she watched the other stalls. She saw the woman selling tie-dyed shirts, laughing with a customer. She saw the man with the pottery wheel, his hands covered in clay, surrounded by a small crowd of onlookers. Then her gaze fell on their own table, on the silent, still forest of animals waiting for a home. She finished her juice, crushed the box in her small fist, and slid off the crate. She walked to the front of the table, picked up Finch, and held it up to a woman who was walking by. "He knows how to fly," Emma said, her voice clear and serious. The woman, startled, stopped and looked down at the small girl and the wooden bird. She smiled, a polite, dismissive expression. "That's very nice, dear," she said, and walked away. Emma's shoulders fell. She didn't cry. She just placed Finch back on the table, its head tilted as if watching the woman go. She walked back to her crate, the light in her eyes a little dimmer than before. Jack's heart ached. This was his failure, not hers. He was the one who couldn't make them see. He was the one who couldn't turn his love and his skill into something the world valued. He was just a man with a wobbly table and a pocket full of sawdust trying to sell his dreams for grocery money. And his dreams, it seemed, weren't worth very much at all. He was about to suggest they pack it in, to surrender to the day, when a shadow fell across the table. He looked up, expecting another passerby. But this was different. The man was tall, dressed in a crisp linen shirt and expensive-looking sunglasses that hid his eyes. He radiated an aura of impatient wealth. He didn't browse. He scanned, his gaze flicking over the toys with a critical, appraising air. "How much for the lot?" the man asked, his voice clipped and dismissive, as if he were buying commodities, not art. The question caught Jack off guard. The whole table." "Yes," the man said, tapping a polished fingernail on the table's edge. "I've got a chain of boutique hotels. These would look quaint in the lobbies. Give me a price." Jack's mind raced. This was it, the miracle, the one big sale that could change everything. He did a quick, desperate calculation in his head, a number that was both fair for his work and high enough to make a difference. $300, Jack said, his voice steadier than he felt. The man scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. $300 for firewood. They're charming, I'll give you that. But they're not art. I'll give you 50. Cash, $50, for weeks of work, for the stories and the memories and the piece of his soul he'd carved into each one. The offer was an insult, a slap in the face disguised as a business transaction. Jack felt a hot flush of anger creep up his neck. He looked at the man's smug, hidden face, and then he looked at Emma, who was watching them with wide, worried eyes. He couldn't let her see him be belittled. He couldn't sell his dignity for $50. He took a slow breath, the air thick with the smell of kettle corn and his own rising pride. "No, thank you," Jack said, his voice quiet but firm. "They're not for sale at that price." The man shrugged, unbothered. "Your loss," he said, and turned to walk away, leaving a trail of cold indifference in his wake. The interaction had taken less than a minute, but it had drained the last of Jack's resolve. He sank onto the edge of the crate, the anger giving way to a hollow, aching emptiness. He had failed. He had stood his ground, but his dignity wouldn't pay the rent. He felt Emma's small hand on his arm. "It's okay, Daddy," she whispered. Finch didn't want to go with him anyway. He looked mean. Jack managed a weak smile and pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. He didn't want her to see the tears that were stinging his eyes. He had one last shred of his pride to protect, and that was her belief in him. They would pack up. They would go home. He didn't know what they would do tomorrow, but for today, the market was over. He had just started to carefully wrap the fox in newspaper when a woman's voice, soft but clear, cut through his thoughts. "Excuse me," she said. "I hope I'm not too late." Jack looked up, his movement slow. She was standing at the edge of his stall, her hands tucked into the pockets of a simple, well-worn trench coat. She wasn't dressed like the other market-goers. There was no flashy jewelry, no designer handbag. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her face was bare of makeup, revealing a spray of faint freckles across her nose. She had kind eyes, the color of moss after a rain, and they were fixed on the wooden animals with an expression of genuine wonder. He hadn't seen her approach. She moved with a quietness that was at odds with the noise of the fair. She seemed to exist in her own pocket of stillness. Jack straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans out of habit. "No, not too late," he said, his voice still rough with the dregs of his earlier encounter. "Just starting to pack up for the day." "Oh, good," she said, a small relieved smile touching her lips. She stepped closer, her gaze drifting from the stern-looking badger to the delicate fawn. She didn't touch them, not at first. She just looked, her head tilted as if she were listening to them. "They're alive," she said, more to herself than to him. The words were so simple, so different from the condescending, quaint, or charming he'd heard all day. He felt a small, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. "I try to make them that way," he said. She finally reached out, her fingers gently tracing the back of the bear. Her hands were elegant with long, slender fingers, but her nails were short and unpolished. A single simple silver ring was the only adornment. "My grandfather used to carve," she said, her voice dropping a little. "He made me a little wooden horse. I carried it everywhere until the legs wore down to nubs." She looked up at him then, and her smile was a little sad, a little nostalgic. "You have his hands," she said. "He always said the story was in the hands." Jack didn't know what to say to that. It was the most profound compliment he'd received in years. He just nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He watched as her gaze fell on Finch, the little Finch still clutched in Emma's hand. Emma, who had been watching the woman with silent intensity, held the bird out slightly, an offering. The woman knelt down so her eyes were level with Emma's. "And who is this little fellow?" she asked, her voice soft. "This is Finch," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's the bravest." "I can see that," the woman said, her eyes twinkling. She didn't patronize. She spoke to Emma like an equal, a fellow connoisseur of small, brave things. She looked from the bird to Emma and then up to Jack, and in that one look, he felt something shift. He wasn't just a failed vendor at a craft fair anymore. He was a father, an artist. He was seen. The woman, who had yet to give her name, stood up slowly, her gaze returning to the collection of animals spread across the blue bedsheet. She seemed to be making a decision, her brow furrowed in thought. The harsh afternoon sun had softened, casting long shadows across the grass, and most of the other vendors were beginning to pack up their wares. The smell of kettle corn had faded, replaced by the scent of cooling asphalt and damp earth. Jack felt a familiar sense of resignation begin to creep back in. She was kind, but kindness didn't change the fact that he was leaving with an almost empty cash box. He braced himself for the polite, "Thank you," and the inevitable turning away. But she didn't turn away. "I'll take them," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Jack blinked. "I'm sorry. All of them," she repeated, her gaze sweeping across the table. "The fox, the bear, the owl, all of them. How much?" The question was the same one the other man had asked, but the tone was entirely different. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a genuine inquiry. Jack was so stunned he couldn't form a number. His mind went blank. He just stared at her, trying to process the words. Was this a joke pity? He looked for some sign of condescension in her eyes, but found only that same calm, mossy sincerity. Emma, however, had no such hesitation. She stepped forward, her small face serious. "You want Finch, too?" The woman looked down at her and smiled gently. "Especially Finch," she said. "If he's for sale." Jack finally found his voice, though it was raspy. I was asking $300 for the set." He said it almost as an apology, expecting her to balk, to tell him it was too much. She didn't even blink. "That's not nearly enough," she said. Jack stared at her, completely bewildered. "What?" "For the material," she said. "The hours, the soul you put into them. $300 is a bargain. I'll give you five." $500, Jack stammered, the number sounding foreign and impossible on his tongue. He had never held that much cash in his hands at once. "No?" she said, a small, almost mischievous smile playing on her lips. $5,000. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. $5,000, the sound of the number echoed in the sudden silence of his mind. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. This woman, this quiet, kind stranger in a worn trench coat, was either crazy or an angel. He suspected the former. "I can't accept that," he said, shaking his head, taking a half step back. That's too much. It's not right." "Why not?" she asked, her head tilted. "Is that not what they're worth?" He was speechless. Of course, they were worth that. In a world that valued time and heart and skill, they were worth even more. But this wasn't that world. This was a world of 5 bills from grumpy grandfathers. "I don't even have a way to process a payment that large," and he said, grasping for a practical objection. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a simple, slim leather wallet. From it, she produced a wad of cash, crisp $100 bills held together by a simple money clip. She counted out 50 of them, her movements quick and efficient, and held the stack out to him. "No processing needed," she said. Jack just stared at the money, then at her face, searching for the catch. There was always a catch, but her expression was open, patient. She wasn't playing a game. He looked at Emma, whose eyes were as wide as saucers. She was looking at the money, yes, but she was also looking at the woman, a look of awe on her face. This was magic, real, tangible magic happening right in front of them. He took the money, his hand trembling slightly. The bills felt unreal, like stage props. He couldn't bring himself to count them. He just held the thick stack, the weight of it both a relief and a burden. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of something he couldn't name. Gratitude, yes, but also a deep, unnerving sense of being off balance, of being rescued by a force he didn't understand. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "You don't have to say anything," she said softly. "Just keep carving." And with that, she began to carefully pack the wooden animals into the boxes he had brought, handling each one with the same care he would have. He watched, still stunned into silence, as the last of his creations disappeared into the cardboard. Ready for a new home he couldn't imagine. The transaction was complete before Jack's mind had fully caught up to the reality of it. The woman, who had introduced herself only as Elizabeth, helped him pack the last of the wooden figures, her movements gentle and deliberate. She treated each piece not as merchandise, but as something precious. When the boxes were sealed, she didn't ask him to help carry them to her car. Instead, she produced a small foldable dolly from the trunk of a surprisingly modest, clean, but not new sedan. She loaded the boxes herself, refusing his offer of help with a quiet shake of her head. "You've done the hard work already," she said. "This is the easy part." He stood there holding the thick stack of cash, feeling useless and overwhelmed. The money felt hot in his hand, a brand of her kindness that he didn't know how to carry. He had 1,000 questions. Who was she? Why had she done this? What did she want? But the questions were stuck in his throat, a tangled knot of pride and disbelief, as she was about to close her car door. Emma, who had been watching the entire exchange in silent awe, ran forward. She held Finch the Finch in her outstretched hands. "You forgot him," she said. Elizabeth turned and knelt, her eyes softening as she looked at the little bird. "Oh, sweetie, I didn't forget him. I think he belongs with you." "But we sold him," Emma said, her voice filled with a child's unwavering sense of fairness. "You paid for him." "I did," Elizabeth agreed. "And now I'm giving him back as a gift. Every brave bird needs a safe nest to come home to." She gently closed Emma's fingers around the wooden finch and gave her hand a soft squeeze. She stood up and looked at Jack, her gaze direct and clear. "I'll be in touch about a potential commission," she said, giving him a reason, an excuse for the exorbitant amount of money she'd given him. "I'll need your contact information." Jack fumbled for a scrap of paper, his hand still shaking as he scribbled down his name and the number for the cheap burner phone he used. He handed it to her, their fingers brushing for a brief moment. Her skin was cool, and the touch sent a jolt through him, an unexpected spark of connection in the midst of his confusion. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "Truly." She just nodded, gave one last soft smile to Emma, and got into her car. She drove away without a backward glance, leaving Jack and Emma standing in the middle of the emptying market, the setting sun casting long golden shadows around them. They were alone with a cardboard box containing a single wooden bird and a stack of cash that felt more like a dream than reality. Jack looked down at the money, then at his daughter, who was clutching Finch to her chest with a look of pure, unadulterated joy. He didn't know who Elizabeth was or why she had just walked into their lives, but as he looked at the hope shining in Emma's eyes, he knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. The drive home was a blur. Jack kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting on the stack of cash in the passenger seat, as if he needed to physically touch it to believe it was real. The truck's engine still coughed and sputtered. The check engine light still glowed defiantly, but for the first time in months, the sounds didn't fill him with a cold dread. They were just sounds, problems that could be fixed, problems that money could solve. Emma was quiet in her seat, cradling Finch in her lap, her small face illuminated by the passing streetlights. She wasn't chattering about the market or the strange, kind woman. She was just content. It was a stillness he hadn't seen in her for a long time. When they got home, the first thing Jack did was walk to the kitchen counter and pick up the stack of envelopes. He opened the one with the red border, the one from the landlord, and smoothed it out. He took 5 of the crisp new bills, folded them neatly, and slid them into the return envelope. The relief was so sudden, so profound that he had to lean against the counter for a moment to steady himself. He could breathe. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could draw a full, deep breath without the weight of impending doom pressing on his chest. "Daddy," Emma's voice came from the doorway. "Are we rich now?" He turned and smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the tired skin around them. "No, pumpkin," he said, scooping her up into his arms. We're not rich. We're okay. And right now, that feels even better. For dinner, they didn't have rice and beans. They went to the local diner, the one with the cracked vinyl booths and the waitress who always called Emma Sugar. Jack ordered a cheeseburger with extra bacon, a chocolate milkshake, and a slice of apple pie for them to share. He let Emma order whatever she wanted, and she chose pancakes with whipped cream and sprinkles, a breakfast feast for a celebratory supper. He paid with one of the new $100 bills, and the waitress's eyes widened. "Hit the lottery!" "Jack?" she asked with a grin. "Something like that," he replied, and for once, it didn't feel like a lie. Later that night, after he had tucked a happy, exhausted Emma into bed, Jack sat alone in the quiet of his garage. The workbench was empty. The space where the wooden animals had once stood was now a stark void. It should have felt sad, but it didn't. It felt like a beginning. He looked at the money still sitting on the passenger seat of the truck, a silent testament to the day's impossible events. He still didn't understand it. He didn't understand her. Elizabeth. The name was as simple and unadorned as she had seemed, but there was nothing simple about what she had done. It wasn't just about the money. It was the way she had looked at his work, the way she had spoken to his daughter, the way she had seen him, really seen him, in a way no one had in years. He thought about her promise to call, the talk of a potential commission. He told himself it was just something she'd said to make the charity of it all less stark, a polite fiction to preserve his dignity. He didn't expect her to actually call. People like that, people who could hand over thousands of dollars without a thought, they didn't move in the same world as men who carved toys in dusty garages. They were a different species altogether. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble scratching his palm. He was tired, but it was a good kind of tired. The kind that comes after a long day of hard work that has finally, impossibly paid off. He picked up the block of maple he'd been saving and a fresh, sharp knife. He didn't know what he was going to carve yet, but he knew he had to, because she had told him to just keep carving. The next 2 days passed in a strange, dreamlike state. Jack woke up each morning, half expecting the money to have vanished, for the whole experience at the market to have been a figment of his sleep-deprived imagination. But the cash was still there, tucked safely in an old coffee can on the top shelf of his closet. The landlord had his rent. The pantry was stocked with more than just beans, and the check engine light in the truck suddenly seemed less like a threat and more like a suggestion. He spent the money carefully, with the cautious hand of a man who knew how quickly it could disappear. He bought Emma a new pair of shoes to replace the ones with the worn-out soles. He bought a new set of carving knives, the sharp German steel feeling impossibly luxurious in his hands. He even bought a real coffee maker, and the rich, dark aroma that filled the house the next morning felt like the ultimate symbol of his new, fragile prosperity. But amidst the relief and the small, practical luxuries, a quiet unease began to settle in. Who was Elizabeth? He replayed their brief interaction over and over in his mind. The way she moved, the quiet confidence in her eyes, the simple but clearly expensive cut of her coat. There was a story there, one that didn't quite line up with her unassuming demeanor. The potential commission she'd mentioned felt more and more like a polite lie, a gentle way of letting him down easy. He told himself it didn't matter. She had given them a lifeline, a clean slate. It was more than anyone had ever done for him. He owed her a debt of gratitude that he could never repay, and he had to be okay with never seeing her again. He threw himself into his work, the new knives moving through the wood with a renewed sense of purpose. He carved a new collection of animals, not for sale this time, but for Emma, for their home. He carved a wise old owl, a playful squirrel, and a magnificent stag with intricate antlers. The garage was once again filled with the soft scent of sawdust and the quiet focus of creation. Emma was thrilled. She spent hours arranging the new figures on her shelf, creating elaborate stories and adventures for them. She still slept with Finch, the Finch tucked under her pillow every night. On the third day, his phone buzzed. It was a number he didn't recognize. His heart gave a sudden, sharp lurch. He answered, his hand unsteady. "Hello." "Jack, it's Elizabeth," Her voice was just as he remembered it, calm and clear, but with an undercurrent of something he couldn't quite place. He leaned against the garage wall, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. "Elizabeth, hi. I I wasn't sure you'd call. I said I would," she replied, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "I hope this is a good time. I was wondering if we could talk about that commission." A commission? She had meant it. The relief was so sharp it almost felt like pain. "Yes, of course," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "Whenever is good for you. How about tomorrow I could stop by your workshop? Say around 10. "Here?" he asked, his mind immediately picturing the dust, the oil stains on the floor, the general state of organized chaos that was his sanctuary. "If that's all right," she said. "I'd love to see where the magic happens." He agreed, his mind already racing. He had less than 24 hours to make his dusty, cluttered garage look like a place where magic happens. He had to clean. He had to organize. He had to somehow transform his humble workshop into a place worthy of a woman who had. In the span of 10 minutes, completely upended his world. The panic was a new and unwelcome sensation. For the first time, he wasn't worried about money. He was worried about her, about Elizabeth. Elizabeth arrived at 10 somewhere on the dot, pulling up in the same modest sedan she'd driven at the market. Jack had spent the entire morning in a cleaning frenzy, sweeping the floors, organizing his tools, and even wiping down the windows until they gleamed. The garage still smelled of sawdust, but it was a clean, crisp scent now, a workshop at its best. He had been so focused on the space that he hadn't thought about himself until he caught his reflection in the newly cleaned window pane. He was wearing his usual work clothes, a faded flannel shirt and jeans stained with wood varnish. There were still traces of grime under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He was who he was, a man who worked with his hands. He hoped that would be enough. He watched from the doorway as she got out of the car. Today she wore a simple black turtleneck and dark jeans, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She carried a large leather portfolio under one arm. She looked less like a mysterious benefactor and more like an architect or a designer, someone with a clear and creative purpose. He met her at the door, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. "Hi," he said, his voice a little too loud in the quiet morning air. "Come on in." She stepped inside, her eyes immediately scanning the space. She took in the neat rows of tools hanging on the pegboard, the stacks of lumber sorted by type, the half-finished carving on his workbench. A small, approving smile touched her lips. "This is a wonderful space," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "It feels honest." "It's a garage," he said with a shrug, feeling the need to downplay the pride that swelled in his chest. "It gets the job done." "It's more than that," she insisted, running a hand over the smooth, worn surface of his workbench. "This is where you make things that matter." He didn't know how to respond to that, so he just gestured to a stool he'd cleared for her. "Can I get you something coffee water?" "I'm fine, thank you," she said, sitting down and placing the portfolio on her lap. "I don't want to take up too much of your time." The formality of her words created a small, awkward distance between them. This wasn't the kind, spontaneous woman from the market. This was a client, a professional. He leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms, waiting. She opened the portfolio. Inside were not architectural drawings or corporate charts, but beautiful, detailed sketches of birds, dozens of them, finches, wrens, sparrows, hummingbirds, all captured in mid-flight, their wings rendered with an artist's eye for detail. "These are incredible," he said, his professional curiosity overriding his personal anxiety. "Did you draw these?" She nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "It's a hobby, something I do to quiet my mind." She looked up at him, her expression turning serious. "I work for a company that's building a new children's hospital. The main atrium is going to have a large-scale mobile, a flock of birds suspended from the ceiling. We've been looking for an artist to create them. When I saw your work at the market, the life you put into them, I knew you were the one. A hospital, a mobile, It was a real project, a massive one. It was the kind of commission artists dreamed of. It was also terrifying. I've never worked on that scale before, he said. Honestly, my pieces are small. They fit in your hand. I know, she said, but the skill is the same. The heart is the same. I believe you can do it. Her faith in him was a tangible thing, a weight and a lift all at once. She explained the details, the timeline, the budget. The numbers she mentioned were staggering, enough to secure his and Maya's future for years to come. It was a lifeline transforming into a bridge to a world he had never imagined being a part of. He should have been elated, but as she spoke, a question nagged at him, a small, persistent splinter of doubt. What kind of company had a budget like this? What kind of woman with a hobby of sketching birds could greenlight a project of this magnitude? The pieces didn't fit. She was more than just an employee, more than just a designer. There was a story here she wasn't telling, and the simple silver ring on her finger suddenly seemed less like a choice and more like a costume. The meeting concluded with a handshake, a formal agreement to move forward. Elizabeth promised to send over the official contracts and a down payment to cover materials as she packed up her portfolio. A small sound from the house caught her attention. The back door creaked open, and Emma appeared. Rubbing the sleep from her eyes with Finch, the Finch clutched in her hand. Her face lit up when she saw Elizabeth. "The bird lady!" she exclaimed, running into the garage and straight to Elizabeth, wrapping her arms around her legs in a fierce hug. Elizabeth, startled at first, softened instantly. She knelt and returned the hug, her professional demeanor melting away, replaced by the same genuine warmth Jack had seen at the market. "Hey, Pumpkin," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she seemed to be trying to suppress. "I see you're taking good care of Finch." "He sleeps on my pillow," Emma said proudly. "He keeps the bad dreams away." She looked up at Elizabeth, her head tilted. "Are you staying for lunch? Daddy makes the best grilled cheese, even when it's a little burnt." Jack stepped forward, a flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. "Emma, honey, Elizabeth is a very busy woman. She has work to do." But Elizabeth was already shaking her head, a real unguarded smile spreading across her face. "I am never too busy for slightly burnt grilled cheese," she said, looking from Emma to Jack. "If the offer's real," Jack hesitated. The thought of this elegant, mysterious woman sitting in his small, cluttered kitchen eating a simple sandwich at his wobbly table was both terrifying and deeply appealing. It felt like a line was being crossed, a boundary blurring between the professional and the personal. He looked at Emma's hopeful face and then at Elizabeth's, which held a similar, though more subtle, plea. He let out a slow breath, a sigh of surrender. "The offer's real," he said, "but I can't make any promises about the burnt parts." The grilled cheese was, in fact, slightly burnt. Jack had been so nervous his hands had been unsteady, and he'd left the sandwiches on the skillet a few seconds too long. He served them on mismatched plates along with a glass of milk for Emma and water for the adults. The kitchen felt small, smaller than usual, with Elizabeth's quiet presence filling the space. She didn't seem to notice the peeling linoleum or the faucet that dripped with a slow, rhythmic plink. She sat at the small table, listening intently as Emma recounted a long, rambling story about a squirrel in their backyard. She laughed in all the right places, asked thoughtful questions, and treated Emma's every word as if it were the most important thing she'd heard all day. Jack watched them from the counter, a dish towel in his hands, feeling like an observer in his own home. He was struck by how natural it felt having her here. It had been so long since a woman's laughter had echoed off these walls. After Rebecca had passed, the house had fallen into a quiet, functional rhythm. It was a space for him and Emma, a fortress against the world. He hadn't let anyone in. Not really. But Elizabeth had walked in without even asking for the key. After lunch, Emma, fueled by sugar and excitement, eventually crashed, falling asleep on the couch with Finch nestled beside her. A soft, comfortable silence settled over the house. Jack found Elizabeth in the living room, standing by the mantelpiece looking at a framed photograph. It was a picture of him and Rebecca taken on their wedding day. They were young, beaming, The whole world stretched out before them. She was beautiful, Elizabeth said softly, not turning around. She was, Jack replied, his voice thick. She was the architect of our lives. I was just the builder. Elizabeth finally turned to face him, her eyes filled with a deep, empathetic sadness. I'm so sorry, Jack. He just nodded, the grief a familiar, dull ache. It's been 3 years, he said. But some days it feels like yesterday. I just try to keep her alive for Emma, in the stories I tell. You do more than that, Elizabeth said. You've built a beautiful life for her, a world full of love and safety. Her words were a balm on a wound he didn't realize was still so raw. He had been so focused on what he couldn't provide, the money, the stability, the mother she deserved, that he had forgotten to see what he had managed to create. I don't know about beautiful, he said, looking around the small, worn room. But it's ours. That's what makes it beautiful, she insisted. She stepped closer, her gaze searching his. You're a good man, Jack. The world doesn't have enough of them. He felt a blush creep up his neck. Unused to such direct, sincere praise. He was used to being judged by the state of his truck, the balance in his bank account. She was judging him by the state of his heart. The air between them crackled with an unspoken energy, a connection that was growing too strong to ignore. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her perfume, a mix of rain and something vaguely floral. He saw the way the light from the window caught in her hair, turning it the color of warm honey. He felt a pull, a longing he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He cleared his throat, taking a step back, breaking the spell. The vulnerability was too much, too soon. I should get back to the garage, he stammered. The contracts. Of course, she said, her smile faltering just a little. She understood. She retreated, giving him the space he was asking for. But her eyes held a hint of disappointment. He had built his walls high for a reason, but for the first time, he found himself wishing he knew how to tear them down. A week later, a courier delivered a thick manila envelope to Jack's door. Inside were the contracts for the hospital mobile project, along with a check for the down payment. The number on the check made Jack's head spin. It was more money than his father had made in a decade of working at the mill. It was life-changing. It was terrifying. He signed the contracts, his hands surprisingly steady, and got to work. The project consumed him. He spent long hours in the garage, transforming the space into a production workshop. He bought new equipment, better lighting, and vast, beautiful sheets of basswood and maple. The garage was no longer just a place of quiet, solitary creation. It was a place of ambitious, focused industry. He hired a young, deaf-mute apprentice from the local community college to help with the sanding and finishing. And for the first time, the garage was filled with the sounds of two people working in tandem. Elizabeth became a regular visitor. She would stop by a few times a week, always under the guise of checking on the project's progress. But they both knew it was more than that. She'd bring coffee or sandwiches from the local deli, and she and Jack would talk while he worked. They talked about everything and nothing. The stubbornness of a particular piece of wood, Emma's latest school project, the way the light changed in the afternoons. They never talked about her life, her world outside of this small, dusty garage. It was an unspoken agreement. Here, she was just Elizabeth, the woman with the kind eyes and the portfolio of bird sketches. She was a natural with Emma. She'd sit with her for hours, drawing, reading, or just listening to her endless stories. She taught her how to fold origami cranes, their small paper flock soon joining the wooden one on the shelf. Jack would watch them, a strange mix of joy and apprehension twisting in his gut. It felt so right, so easy having her here. It felt like they were a family, and that was the most dangerous feeling of all. One rainy Tuesday afternoon. Elizabeth arrived looking pale and distracted. She was quieter than usual, her smile strained at the edges. She watched Jack work, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. "You okay?" he finally asked, setting down his carving knife. She looked up, startled, as if pulled from a deep, troubled thought. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was thin. "Just a long day." He didn't believe her, but he didn't push. Later, as she was leaving, her phone rang. He saw the name on the screen before she could hide it. James. Her face tightened, and she quickly silenced the call, shoving the phone back into her pocket. "I have to go," she said abruptly and left without her usual warm goodbye. The incident was a small tear in the carefully woven fabric of their new reality. It was a reminder that she had a life beyond these walls, a life with people named James, who made her face cloud over. It was a reminder that he knew nothing about her. Not really. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself sitting in front of his old laptop, the one he rarely used. He hesitated for a long moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. It felt like a betrayal, a violation of the unspoken trust they had built. But the doubt was a poison, and he needed the antidote of truth. He typed her name, Elizabeth, into the search bar, then paused. He didn't know her last name. He typed in what he did know. Elizabeth and Children's Hospital Art Commission. The results loaded, and the world tilted once more. The first hit was a press release from a major philanthropic foundation. Morgan Foundation announces partnership with Lakeside Children's Hospital for atrium installation. And there, in the first paragraph, was her name, Elizabeth Morgan, the foundation's chairwoman and the sole heiress to the Morgan Global conglomerate. The article was accompanied by a photo. It was her, but not his Elizabeth. This Elizabeth was dressed in a sharp power suit, her hair in a sleek, severe style, her smile polished and professional. She was standing next to a group of men in suits, shaking hands with the mayor. She looked powerful, untouchable. A woman who moved in circles so far above his, he couldn't even imagine them. He clicked on her name, and the story unfolded. Billionaire heiress, philanthropist, a shrewd businesswoman who had taken over the family empire after her father's retirement. There were articles about her company's stock prices, her real estate holdings, her place on lists of the world's most influential people. There was even a short, vague mention of a highly public, acrimonious split from a man named James Parker, a rival tycoon. James. The name from her phone. It all clicked into place. The money, the commission, her quiet elegance, her reluctance to talk about her life. She hadn't been lying. Not exactly. She had just omitted the billion-dollar truth. Jack leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen illuminating his stunned face. The woman who ate his burnt grilled cheese, who laughed at his daughter's silly jokes, who had looked at him with such sincere warmth, was one of the wealthiest women in the country. The garage, his sanctuary, suddenly felt very small. The project, his great opportunity, now felt like a handout. And the fragile, beautiful thing that had been growing between them felt like a lie. He didn't feel anger. Not yet. He just felt a deep, hollow coldness. He had been a project, a diversion, a quaint little carpenter who provided a brief, charming escape from her real life. He had let her in. He had let himself hope. And he had been a fool. The next day, when Elizabeth arrived at the workshop, the air was different. The scent of sawdust was still there. The tools were still in their places, but the warmth was gone. Jack was polite, professional. His responses to her questions clipped and concise. He didn't meet her eyes. He kept his focus on the half-finished wooden eagle on his workbench, his knife moving with a sharp, aggressive precision. Elizabeth felt the shift immediately. The easy camaraderie they had built was gone, replaced by a tense, formal distance. She tried to bridge the gap, asking about Emma, telling a funny story about her drive over, but her words fell into the silence and died. "Jack, what's wrong?" she finally asked, her voice soft. He didn't look up. "Nothing's wrong. The project is on schedule." "This isn't about the project," she said, stepping closer. "This is about us. You're barely looking at me. Did I do something?" He finally set down his knife and turned to face her, his eyes cold and hard. "I know who you are. Elizabeth, or should I say, Miss Morgan. Her name, her real name, hung in the air between them like an accusation. She flinched, her face paling. The color drained from her cheeks, and she took an involuntary step back. Jack, You should have told me, he said, his voice low and tight, each word a carefully controlled release of the hurt and anger that had been simmering all night. You let me believe you were just someone. You let me welcome you into my home, into my daughter's life, all while you were playing a part. It wasn't a part, she insisted, her voice trembling. This was the only place I felt like I wasn't playing a part. This was the only place I could just be Elizabeth. Elizabeth who, he shot back. Elizabeth, the woman with a hobby of sketching, or Elizabeth Morgan, the billionaire who can buy and sell entire towns like this one, who can hand out million-dollar hospital commissions like their party favors. The money doesn't change who I am, she pleaded. It changes everything, he exclaimed, his voice finally breaking, the raw emotions spilling out. It changes the way you saw me. It changes what this is. I wasn't a man you met at a market. I was a charity case, a sob story you could fix with your checkbook. That is not true, she cried, tears welling in her eyes. I saw you, Jack. I saw your heart, your talent. I saw the way you love your daughter. That has nothing to do with money. Doesn't it? Would you have even noticed me if you weren't looking for a new pet project? The words were cruel, and he knew it the moment they left his mouth, but he couldn't take them back. He wanted to hurt her the way he felt hurt. He wanted her to feel the sting of his humiliation. Her face crumpled, the tears now streaming down her cheeks. She didn't try to defend herself further. She just stood there, absorbing the blow. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, filled with the wreckage of what they had built. I never, for 1 second, thought of you as a project, she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought of you as a friend. Maybe more. He just shook his head, turning his back on her, unable to look at her tears, unable to face the possibility that he was wrong. I think you should go, he said, his voice flat. She stood there for a long, heartbreaking moment. Then she turned and walked out of the garage, the sound of her footsteps fading on the gravel. The door swung shut behind her, leaving Jack alone in the sudden, crushing silence, the smell of sawdust mingling with the bitter scent of regret. Life after Elizabeth was a study in gray. The sun still rose, the coffee still brewed, and the work in the garage continued, but the color had been drained from Jack's world. He moved through his days like a ghost, his actions mechanical, his heart a hollow, aching space in his chest. He finished the mobile for the hospital, his hands moving with a skill that felt disconnected from his soul. The wooden birds were technically perfect, their wings carved with precision, their forms sanded to a flawless finish, but they were lifeless. The spark, the indefinable essence that had made his earlier work so special, was gone. He delivered the finished pieces on schedule, his interaction with the hospital foundation brief and professional. He never mentioned Elizabeth's name, and they didn't either. The final check arrived in the mail, another staggering sum that he deposited into his bank account without a flicker of joy. The money was a constant, bitter reminder of her, of the lie, of his own foolish, hopeful heart. Emma felt the change most acutely. Her father was there, but he wasn't. He didn't laugh as much. He didn't tell stories while he carved. He was a quiet, sad version of the dad she knew. Is the bird lady ever coming back? She asked one night at dinner, her voice small and tentative. Jack's hand froze, his fork hovering over his plate. I don't think so. Pumpkin, he said, his voice gentle but firm, a tone that discouraged further questions. Emma didn't ask again, but a shadow fell over her bright spirit. She stopped leaving her origami cranes on the workshop bench. She played with Finch the finch less often. The house grew quieter, the silence between them filled with the unspoken name of the woman they both missed. Jack tried to fill the void. He took Emma on trips to the park, to the library, to the zoo. He bought her new books and art supplies. He tried to be both father and mother, friend and playmate, but he couldn't replicate the easy, natural warmth that Elizabeth had brought into their lives. He couldn't fake the light she had sparked in both of them. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, he found a small, folded piece of paper. It was one of Elizabeth's sketches, a quick, simple drawing of a sparrow she had left behind on one of her visits. He unfolded it, his fingers tracing the delicate pencil lines. It was just a bird on a piece of paper, but it was so full of life, so full of her. He sank onto the floor, the sketch held in his hands, and the grief he had been suppressing finally broke through. It wasn't just anger he felt, it was loss, a profound, gut-wrenching loss. He had pushed her away. He had let his pride and his fear build a wall so high that she couldn't climb it. He had accused her of seeing him as a project, but in the end, he was the one who couldn't see past the money, past the name. He had let her real self be obscured by the billion-dollar shadow she cast, and he was suffocating in the lonely, quiet world he had chosen. Elizabeth sat in the sterile silence of the Morgan Global boardroom, a ghost at the head of a long, polished table. The room was filled with men in dark suits, their faces grim, their voices a low drone of quarterly reports and market projections. She was physically present, her posture perfect, her expression a carefully constructed mask of neutral competence. But her mind was miles away in a dusty garage that smelled of cedar and hope. She had returned to her world, the world she had once run from and then run back to. It was just as she remembered, cold, demanding, utterly devoid of joy. The days were a blur of meetings, conference calls, and strategic decisions that affected thousands of people, but touched her in no meaningful way. James Parker was back in her orbit, a constant, smirking presence at the edge of her vision. He had been a partner at a rival firm, and their personal and professional lives had once been deeply, disastrously intertwined. After their public split, he had made it his mission to undermine her, a slow, patient campaign of corporate warfare. Now, with the Morgan board sensing her distraction and vulnerability, they had brought him in as a consultant, a move that was a thinly veiled threat. He watched her across the table, his eyes glinting with a triumphant cruelty. He knew she was wounded, and he was circling like a shark that had scented blood. She ignored him, focusing on the papers in front of her, but his presence was a constant, grating reminder of her past failures, of her own poor judgment in trusting someone so completely. Her apartment, a minimalist penthouse overlooking the city, felt less like a home and more like a beautifully designed prison. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the city below. She had everything money could buy: art, comfort, security, but she was achingly, profoundly lonely. She missed the sound of Emma's laughter. She missed the scent of Jack's workshop. She missed the taste of burnt grilled cheese. She missed the man who had looked at her, not at her bank account. One evening, she found herself in her home studio, a space she hadn't entered in months. Her sketches were still pinned to the wall, the bird still frozen in mid-flight. She picked up a charcoal pencil, the feel of it familiar and foreign in her hand. She tried to draw, but her hand was stiff, her lines lifeless. The magic was gone. It had lived in a small garage with a man who thought she was just Elizabeth. She put the pencil down and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Looking out at the glittering expanse of the city, she had built an empire, but she had lost herself in the process. Jack had accused her of playing a part, and he was right. She had been playing the part of Elizabeth Morgan, the powerful, untouchable heiress, for so long that she had forgotten how to be anyone else. But in a small, unassuming town, for a few brief, beautiful weeks, she had remembered. She had been just Elizabeth, and she had never felt more real. That was the life she wanted, the self she wanted to be. But she had let fear and a man's wounded pride chase her away from it. The question now was whether she had the courage to fight her way back in the days that followed. Elizabeth moved through her corporate life with a new sense of purpose. She was more focused, more engaged than she had been in months. But it wasn't because she had recommitted to the Morgan Empire. It was because she had made a decision. She was going to find a way to bridge the two halves of her life, to be both Elizabeth Morgan and just Elizabeth. And to do that, she needed allies. She started with her most trusted advisor, her father's old friend and her godfather, Harold Bennett. He was the only person on the board who had ever seen through her professional mask, who had known her as a young girl with scraped knees and a penchant for climbing trees. She invited him to lunch at a small, out-of-the-way cafe, away from the corporate towers and prying eyes. "I need your help, Harry," she said, after they had exchanged pleasantries. I'm making some changes." The old man looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup, his shrewd eyes softening. "About time," he said. "You've been miserable for years." His bluntness startled a laugh out of her. "Am I that transparent?" "Only to those who care to look," he replied. "And there aren't many of us left. What kind of changes are we talking about?" She told him everything. About Jack and Emma, about the wooden birds and the hospital project, about the quiet joy she had found in a simple life, and the crushing emptiness she felt upon returning to her own. She told him about James Parker's reappearance and the board's growing unease with her leadership. Harry listened without interruption, his weathered face thoughtful. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "So you fell in love with a carpenter," he said. It wasn't a question. Elizabeth felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," he replied. "It's written all over your face. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" "That's why I need your help," she said, leaning forward. "I want to start a new foundation, one focused on supporting traditional craftsmanship, artisans who work with their hands like Jack. I want to create a space where their work can be showcased, valued, and I want to do it in Mapleton." Harry raised an eyebrow. "A pet project?" She flinched at the phrase, so close to the accusation Jack had hurled at her. "No, a mission, a purpose beyond quarterly profits and market shares, something that matters." "And James Parker," her expression hardened. "He's a problem. He's poisoning the board against me, and he's not going to stop. But he's not my primary concern right now." Harry studied her for a long moment, his eyes calculating. Then he nodded, a decisive gesture. "All right, I'm in. But you know this won't be easy. The board isn't going to like you diverting resources to a small-town art project, and Parker will use it against you." "Let him try," she said, a steely resolve in her voice that surprised even her. "I've spent too long letting other people dictate who I am and what I care about. I'm done with that." Harry smiled, a proud, paternal expression. "There she is," he said softly. "The little girl who used to tell her father's business associates that their ties were ugly. I've missed her." Elizabeth laughed, a genuine sound that felt rusty in her throat. "She's been gone a while, but she's coming back." That evening, Elizabeth sat at her desk, surrounded by sketches and notes. She was outlining her plan for what she was calling the Heritage Hands Foundation. It would be a non-profit dedicated to preserving and promoting traditional craftsmanship. It would provide grants, education, and a platform for artisans working in wood, metal, textiles, and other traditional materials. And its flagship project would be a gallery in Mapleton, showcasing local talent. She was deep in thought when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Harry. "Parker's making moves. Board meeting tomorrow. He's presenting a proposal to restructure the company. You're in his crosshairs." Elizabeth felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. This was it. The confrontation she had been avoiding. Parker was making his play for control, and he had timed it perfectly, striking when he thought she was at her weakest. She texted back, "I'll be ready." The board meeting was set for 9 a.m. in the main conference room of the Morgan Tower. Elizabeth arrived at 7, giving herself time to prepare. She wore her armor a crisp, charcoal suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her makeup flawless. She looked every inch the corporate warrior, the billionaire heiress ready for battle. But underneath, her heart raced with a different kind of courage, the courage to be vulnerable, to be honest, to be herself. At 8:30, Harry arrived, giving her a reassuring nod. "You've got this," he said quietly. "Just remember why you're fighting." The other board members filed in, a procession of pinstripes and power ties. Last to arrive was James Parker, impeccably dressed in a bespoke suit, a smug smile playing on his lips. He took his seat at the far end of the table, directly opposite Elizabeth, a symbolic challenge that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The meeting began with the usual formalities: minutes from the previous meeting, reports from various departments. Elizabeth listened attentively, making notes, asking questions, demonstrating her command of the company's operations. Then, as the morning wore on, the chairman, a stern older man named Wallace, turned to Parker. "Mr. Parker, I believe you have a proposal for us." Parker stood, his movements smooth, practiced. He distributed a bound document to each board member, the Morgan logo prominently displayed on the cover. Elizabeth received hers last, a calculated slight. She opened it to find what she had expected: a comprehensive plan to restructure the company, shifting power away from her and into the hands of a new executive committee, with Parker conveniently positioned as its head. "Gentlemen, and of course, Ms. Morgan," Parker began, his voice oily with false deference. "What I'm proposing is a modernization of Morgan Global's leadership structure, a move away from the, shall we say, traditional family-centric model to a more distributed, agile approach." Elizabeth listened as he laid out his vision, a thinly veiled coup wrapped in corporate jargon. He was good, she had to admit. He spoke with confidence, with charm, painting a picture of a company rejuvenated under his guidance. He never directly criticized her leadership, but the implication was clear: she was a relic, a figurehead, not the true leader the company needed. When he finished, there was a murmur of approval from several board members. Elizabeth felt a momentary flicker of doubt. Parker was persuasive, and he had clearly been laying the groundwork for this moment for months. Quietly gathering support. "Thank you, Mr. Parker," Wallace said. "Ms. Morgan, would you like to respond?" All eyes turned to her. This was the moment. She could feel the weight of their expectations, their judgment. She could play the game, counter Parker's proposal with one of her own. Fight him on his own terms in the corporate battlefield they both knew so well. But as she looked around the table, at these men who knew her name, but not her heart, she made a different choice. She chose to be Elizabeth, just Elizabeth. She stood, her posture straight but not rigid, her face open. "I'm not going to respond to Mr. Parker's proposal directly," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Instead, I'd like to tell you a story." She saw the surprise on their faces, the confusion. This wasn't the corporate counterpunch they had expected. Parker's smug smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "3 months ago, I was at a small craft market in Mapleton," she began. "I was there because I needed to get away from all of this." She gestured to the room, the tower, the empire that bore her name. "I was there because I had forgotten who I was beneath the title and the responsibility and the endless meetings. And I met a man there, a carpenter named Jack Wilson." She told them about the wooden animals, about the life and soul Jack carved into each piece. She told them about Emma, the brave little girl who had lost her mother. She told them about the hospital mobile project, about the joy she had found in a simple garage, about the peace that came from being valued for herself, not her wealth or her name. Mr. Parker's proposal is built on the assumption that Morgan Global needs to move away from family values, from personal connection, from the human touch that my grandfather and my father built into its foundation, she said, her voice growing stronger. "He's wrong. What this company needs, what I needed, is to remember those values, not discard them." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small wooden object. It was a finch, intricately carved from dark walnut wood. She placed it in the center of the table. "This is craftsmanship," she said. "This is what we've lost in our rush to scale, to automate, to maximize profit at the expense of humanity. And this is what I'm proposing we reclaim. She outlined her plan for the Heritage Hands Foundation, not as a side project or a vanity initiative, but as a core part of Morgan Global's new direction, a commitment to supporting human craftsmanship, to preserving traditional skills, to valuing the hands that build as much as the minds that conceive. This isn't just about wooden birds, she said, looking directly at Parker, who was now watching her with a mix of disdain and growing alarm. This is about who we are as a company. This is about legacy. My grandfather started Morgan Global making furniture by hand. My father expanded it by respecting the craftsmen who build our products. I've lost sight of that. We all have. And it's time to find our way back. She finished speaking. The room silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. She had laid herself bare, shown them her heart, her vision, her truth. She had broken every rule of corporate gamesmanship. She had been vulnerable, and she waited for their judgment. It was Harry who broke the silence. He picked up the wooden finch, turning it in his gnarled hands, feeling the smoothness of the grain. I remember your grandfather's workshop, he said, his voice gruff with emotion. He would have loved this. He would have understood exactly what you're talking about. Elizabeth, and I think your father would, too. He set the bird down and looked around the table. I move that we reject Mr. Parker's proposal and instead form a committee to explore Miss Morgan's Heritage Hands initiative as part of a broader recommitment to the company's founding values. Wallace cleared his throat, clearly taken aback by the turn the meeting had taken. That's an unusual motion. Harry, perhaps we should take some time to consider both proposals more carefully. I second the motion, said a quiet voice from the end of the table. It was Mrs. Chen, the oldest member of the board, a woman who had rarely spoken at meetings in the 5 years Elizabeth had known her. I, too, remember the old days, the better days. I would like to see them return. Parker stood, his face flushed with anger. This is absurd, he snapped. We're running a global corporation, not a charity for small-town woodworkers. Ms. Morgan is clearly letting personal sentiment cloud her business judgment. This is exactly why the leadership structure needs to change. Is it sentiment to remember our roots, Mr. Parker? Mrs. Chen asked, her voice mild but her eyes sharp. Is it poor judgment to value the human touch in an increasingly mechanized world? I think not. I think it is wisdom. The vote that followed was close, too close for comfort, but in the end, Harry's motion carried, Parker's proposal was rejected, and a committee was formed to explore Elizabeth's Heritage Hands initiative. It wasn't a complete victory. Several board members had sided with Parker, and the tension in the room was palpable, but it was a start, a beachhead from which to launch her real campaign. Parker stormed out of the room without a word, but the look he gave Elizabeth was clear. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. As the other board members filed out, Harry approached Elizabeth, the wooden finch in his hand. That was quite a performance, he said, handing her the bird. Your father would have been proud, but Parker's not going to give up. He's going to fight you every step of the way. Let him, Elizabeth said, her voice tired but determined. I'm fighting for something that matters now. That makes all the difference. Harry studied her for a moment, then nodded. Yes, it does. So, what's your next move? Elizabeth looked down at the wooden finch in her hand, her thumb tracing the smooth curve of its wing. I need to go back to Mapleton, she said. I need to talk to Jack. And if he doesn't want to talk to you, she smiled, a small, sad curve of her lips. Then I'll have to find a way to make him listen. I'm pretty stubborn when I want something. Harry laughed, a short, genuine bark of amusement. That, my dear, is the understatement of the century. The drive to Mapleton felt both longer and shorter than Elizabeth remembered. The landscape rolled by outside her car window, the city giving way to suburbs, then to the gentle, rolling hills and small towns that dotted the countryside. The further she got from the glass and the steel of the Morgan Tower, the lighter she felt, as if she were shedding layers of a too-tight skin. She had called ahead to the Lakeside Children's Hospital, speaking with the director about her plans for the Heritage Hands Gallery. She wanted to establish a formal connection between the hospital and the gallery, a partnership that would bring Jack's work to a wider audience and create opportunities for children to engage with traditional crafts. The director had been enthusiastic, another small victory in her campaign to bridge her two worlds. But as she approached Mapleton, as the familiar landmarks came into view, her confidence began to waver. What if Jack refused to see her? What if the damage she had done was irreparable? What if he had moved on, built a new life with the money from the hospital project, a life that had no room for her? She pushed the thoughts away, focusing on the road, on the plan. She had come too far to turn back now. She would face whatever awaited her in Mapleton, whatever Jack's reaction might be. She owed him that much, at least, the truth, the whole truth, and the chance to decide for himself. It was late afternoon when she pulled up outside Jack's house. The truck was in the driveway, a good sign. He was home. She sat in her car for a long moment, gathering her courage. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, wrapped package. It was time. She walked to the door, her heart hammering in her chest, and knocked. There was a long silence. Then the sound of footsteps. The door opened, and there he was, Jack, looking tired, a bit thinner, but still so handsome it made her breath catch. He froze when he saw her, his expression cycling through surprise, wariness, and something else, something she couldn't quite read. "Elizabeth," he said, her name a rough whisper. "Hello, Jack," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "May I come in? I have something I need to tell you." He hesitated, his hand still on the door, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he might close it in her face. But then he stepped back, a silent invitation. The house was just as she remembered it, small, worn, but filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. There were new wooden animals on the shelves. She noticed, new creations born in her absence. The thought gave her a pang of sadness, of loss. "Emma's at a friend's house," Jack said, answering her unasked question. "She'll be back for dinner." Elizabeth nodded, suddenly unsure where to begin. All the speeches she had rehearsed in the car seemed inadequate now, in the face of his quiet presence. "I heard about the hospital mobile," she said finally. "They love it. Everyone does." "Good," he said, his voice neutral. "That's good." The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things unsaid. Elizabeth took a deep breath, then held out the package. "I made something for you," she said. "It's not as beautiful as your work, but it's the best I could do." He took the package with a puzzled expression, unwrapping it carefully. Inside was a small, leather-bound book. He opened it to find page after page of sketches. Birds in flight, birds at rest, birds singing, and on the final page, a detailed drawing of a man and a little girl, sitting in a garage, surrounded by wooden animals, their faces alight with joy. "It's my story," Elizabeth said softly. "The story of how I found myself in a dusty garage with a man who saw me. Not my name, not my money, just me." Jack looked up from the book, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since she'd arrived. "Why are you here, Elizabeth?" "Because I made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "Because I should have told you the truth from the beginning. Because I've spent my entire life being Elizabeth Morgan, and the only time I've ever been happy, truly happy, was when I was just Elizabeth, with you, with Emma. And I want that back. I want a second chance." She told him then. Everything. About the board meeting, about Parker, about the Heritage Hands Foundation, about her plan to open a gallery in Mapleton, to create a space where artisans like him could showcase their work, where children could learn traditional crafts, where art and community could flourish. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said, when she had finished. "I'm asking you to let me show you who I really am. Both parts of me. Elizabeth Morgan and just Elizabeth, because they're both real. Jack, and they both care about you. Very much." Jack stood motionless, the sketchbook still open in his hands, the weight of Elizabeth's words settling around him like dust after a storm. He looked down at the drawing of him and Emma, rendered with such care, such attention to detail. She had captured Emma's smile perfectly, the slight gap where she'd lost a tooth last month, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she was truly happy. And she had drawn him not as he saw himself tired, worn, struggling, but as she saw him strong, gentle, alive with purpose. He closed the book slowly, his calloused fingers tracing the leather binding. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things he wanted to say but couldn't find the words for. "You heard us," he said finally, his voice low. "Emma keeps asking when the bird lady is coming back. I don't know what to tell her." "I know," Elizabeth whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And I'm so sorry. Jack, I never meant to hurt either of you. I was trying to protect myself. I've spent my whole life watching people change when they learn who I am, what I have. I just wanted to be seen for me. Not my bank account, not my last name. Just me." "So you lied." "I omitted," she corrected gently. "I never said I wasn't Elizabeth Morgan. I just didn't say I was. It was selfish. I see that now. But Jack, everything else was real. The way I feel about your work, the way I feel about Emma," she paused, taking a shaky breath, "the way I feel about you." Jack's heart gave a painful lurch. He wanted to believe her. God, how he wanted to. But the wound was still too fresh, the betrayal too sharp. "And this gallery, this foundation, what is that? A way to ease your conscience? Another charity project?" Elizabeth flinched at the echo of his earlier accusation, but her gaze remained steady. "No, it's a mission, a purpose, something I believe in because you showed me its value. You reminded me of where my family came from, what we've lost in the pursuit of growth and profit. This isn't about charity, Jack. It's about legacy. My grandfather's, my father's, yours. Mine," she nodded, stepping closer, her eyes alight with a passion he hadn't seen before. "Your hands, Jack, they create magic. They tell stories. They preserve a craft that's being lost in a world of mass production and disposable goods. That deserves to be celebrated, to be shared, to be taught to the next generation. That's what the Heritage Hands Gallery would do. And yes, I want you to be part of it, but it's going to exist with or without you, because it matters, because it's right." Jack studied her face, looking for signs of the polished, corporate mask he had glimpsed in those online photos. But there was none. This was Elizabeth, his Elizabeth, with her messy bun and her freckles and her eyes that saw him, really saw him. "And what about us?" he asked, the question hanging between them like a fragile, newborn thing. "What do you want there?" "A second chance," she said simply. "A chance to be honest, to be whole, to see if what we felt, what I still feel is strong enough to bridge our two worlds. I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I'm asking for the opportunity to earn that forgiveness, day by day, with complete transparency." Jack set the sketchbook down on the coffee table, his movements deliberate. He was a methodical man, a man who measured twice and cut once, who believed in the patient, careful work of creating something that would last. He couldn't rush this decision, this turning point. "I need time," he said finally, "to think, to figure out what's best for Emma. For me." Elizabeth nodded, a sad smile touching her lips. "I understand. I'll wait. Jack, however long it takes." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, setting it next to the sketchbook. "My personal number is on the back. If you're ready to talk more, I'll be there." She turned to go, her shoulders straight but her steps heavy. At the door, she paused, looking back at him with a vulnerability that made his chest ache. "For what it's worth," she said softly, "those weeks here, with you and Emma, were the happiest of my life, whatever you decide. I wanted you to know that." Then she was gone, the door closing quietly behind her. Jack stood in the silent living room, the sketchbook and business card lying on the table like artifacts from another life. A life that could have been, a life that still might be outside, in her car. Elizabeth finally let the tears come. They fell hot and fast, a release of tension and hope and fear. She had done it. She had laid her heart bare, had shown Jack all of her, the billionaire heiress, and the woman who loved the smell of sawdust and the sound of a child's laughter. Now all she could do was wait, and hope, and continue building the bridge from her side. Whether he chose to cross it or not, she started the car, wiping the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. She had a hotel room reserved in town. She would stay for a few days, meeting with local officials about permits for the gallery, talking to the director of the Children's Hospital about their partnership. She would lay the groundwork, plant the seeds, and maybe, just maybe, she would get the chance to see if they could grow into something beautiful. The days that followed were a strange limbo for Jack. He moved through his routines, making breakfast for Emma, driving her to school, working in the garage, but his mind was elsewhere, caught in a loop of memories and questions and doubts. He told Emma that he had seen Elizabeth, that she was in town for a while, working on a new project. He didn't tell her about the gallery, about the possibility of Elizabeth becoming a permanent part of their lives again. He couldn't bear to raise her hopes, only to dash them if he decided the risk was too great. But Emma was perceptive, too perceptive sometimes. She sensed the shift in him, the quiet tension that hummed beneath his careful normalcy. "Is the bird lady still sad?" she asked one night as he tucked her into bed. Jack paused in the act of pulling up her covers. "What makes you think she was sad?" Emma shrugged, a small, thoughtful movement. Her eyes, they looked like yours did after Mommy went to heaven, like they were trying to smile but couldn't remember how. Jack's heart contracted painfully. Out of the mouths of babes. "I think she was sad." "Yes," he said carefully, "but I think she's trying to be happy again." Emma nodded, satisfied with this answer. "Good. I like her better when she's happy." "You too." "Me too. What?" "I like you better when you're happy," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "And you were happy when she was here. You laughed more." Jack looked at his daughter, this small, wise creature who saw so clearly what he had been trying to ignore. He had been happy with Elizabeth, happier than he had been since Rebecca died. Despite the lies, no, the omissions, despite the gulf between their worlds. Being with her had brought color back into his life, and pushing her away had drained it again. "When did you get so smart, Pumpkin?" he asked, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. She grinned, a flash of gap-toothed mischief. "I was born this way. You just didn't notice because you were too busy being a grown-up." He laughed, a genuine sound that felt rusty in his throat. "Fair enough. Time for sleep now. Smarty pants." He kissed her forehead and turned out the light, leaving her door cracked open just the way she liked it, in the hallway. He paused, leaning against the wall, his daughter's words echoing in his mind. "You were happy when she was here. You laughed more." It was true, for all his anger, all his wounded pride. He couldn't deny that Elizabeth had brought joy into their lives. She had seen him, really seen him in a way no one had since Rebecca. She had valued his work not for its market price, but for the soul he poured into it. She had treated Emma not as a child to be humored, but as a person to be respected. And she had lied, no, omitted a fundamental truth about herself. But hadn't he done the same in his own way? Hadn't he presented only the parts of himself he thought were acceptable, hiding his fears, his struggles, his deep, gnawing insecurity? He went to the living room and picked up the sketchbook she had left. He opened it again, turning the pages slowly, taking in the careful lines, the attention to detail, the love evident in every stroke. This wasn't the work of someone playing a role. This was Elizabeth, just Elizabeth, reaching out across the divide, trying to build a bridge. He reached for his phone, then hesitated. It was late, almost midnight, but somehow he knew she would be awake. He dialed the number on the back of the business card, his heart racing as it rang once, twice, 3 times. "Jack." Her voice was alert, hopeful, a bit breathless, as if she had rushed to answer. "Hi," he said, suddenly unsure what to say next. I, I hope it's not too late to call. No, she said quickly. No, it's fine. I was just, I was sketching, actually. More birds. A squirrel. This time, I'm branching out. A small, tentative joke. He smiled despite himself. I'd like to see it someday. The silence that followed was charged with meaning. Someday, a future, a possibility. Jack, she said softly, I'd like that, too. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. I've been thinking about what you said, about the gallery, about us. I'm still thinking. Actually, but I was wondering if you might want to have dinner tomorrow, with me and Emma. Nothing fancy, just dinner. A start. I'd love that, she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice, the relief, the joy. More than anything. Good, he said, his own smile growing. That's good. Around 6. 6 is perfect. Should I bring anything? Just yourself, he said. All of yourself. Elizabeth Morgan and just Elizabeth. We want to get to know both of them. The next evening, as the clock ticked closer to 6, Jack found himself uncharacteristically nervous. He had changed his shirt twice, had actually ironed his best jeans, had even dug out the cologne Rebecca had given him for their last anniversary. The bottle still half full, Emma was equally excited, bouncing from room to room, her energy contagious. She had insisted on helping with dinner, carefully tearing lettuce for the salad, setting the table with their mismatched plates and silverware. Do you think she'll like my new drawings? She asked for the third time, gesturing to the stack of artwork she had arranged on the coffee table. I made a special one of Finch flying over the mountains. She'll love them, Jack assured her, checking the lasagna in the oven. It was Rebecca's recipe, one of the few dishes he had mastered, rich with cheese and spices. Elizabeth loves art. Remember, she's an artist herself. The doorbell rang at precisely 6 o'clock. Emma let out a squeal of excitement and raced to answer it, Jack following at a more measured pace, his heart hammering against his ribs. Elizabeth stood on the porch, a vision in a simple green dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She held a small gift bag in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. But what struck Jack most was her expression open, hopeful, a bit nervous, human, real. Bird lady, Emma cried, launching herself at Elizabeth with the unrestrained enthusiasm only a child can muster. Elizabeth laughed, kneeling to accept the hug, the gift bag dangling forgotten from her wrist. Hello, sweetheart, she said, holding Emma tight. I've missed you so much. I missed you too, Emma declared, pulling back to look at Elizabeth seriously. Daddy said you were working on a big project. Is it done now? Can you stay? Elizabeth glanced up at Jack, a question in her eyes. How much should she say? How much had he told Emma? Elizabeth is working on a very special project right here in Mapleton, Jack said, stepping forward. A place where artists like us can show their work. She'll be around quite a bit because of that. Really? Emma's eyes widened with delight. Will our animals be there? Will people see them? If your dad wants them to be, Elizabeth said carefully. It's his decision. Emma turned to Jack, her expression suddenly serious. You should say yes, Daddy. Your animals are the best in the whole world. Everyone should see them. Jack smiled, ruffling his daughter's hair. I'll think about it. Pumpkin, now. Why don't you show Elizabeth the new drawings you made while I check on dinner? As Emma eagerly led Elizabeth to the coffee table, chattering about her artwork, Jack retreated to the kitchen, needing a moment to compose himself. The sight of Elizabeth kneeling to hug his daughter, the casual mention of the gallery as if it were already a certainty, the easy way she had deferred to his authority as Emma's father, it was all so different from the corporate power player he had glimpsed in those online photos. This was a woman navigating two worlds, trying to find a path that honored both. Dinner was a surprisingly relaxed affair. Emma dominated the conversation, filling Elizabeth in on everything she had missed her new friend at school, the squirrel that had taken up residence in the oak tree outside her window, the chapter book she was reading about a girl who could talk to animals. Elizabeth listened with genuine interest, asking questions, laughing at Emma's jokes, her eyes bright with a joy that couldn't be feigned. Jack found himself watching her more than participating, struck by how naturally she fit at their small kitchen table, how right it felt to have her there. After dinner, as Emma showed Elizabeth her room, proudly displaying her collection of origami cranes alongside the wooden animals Jack had carved, he cleared the table and loaded the dishwasher, his mind turning over the evening's events. It had been good, easy, natural, as if the painful confrontation in the garage, the weeks of silence, had been a detour rather than a dead end. But was it enough? Could they really bridge the gap between their worlds? Could he trust her again, fully and completely? He was still pondering these questions when Elizabeth returned to the kitchen, a sleeping Emma cradled in her arms. She conked out mid-sentence, Elizabeth whispered, a tender smile on her face. Something about a dream she had where Finch grew to the size of a horse and they flew to the moon. Jack chuckled softly. That sounds like her. Here, I'll take her. He gently took his daughter from Elizabeth's arms, cradling her against his chest. She was getting so big, so fast. Soon she would be too heavy to carry like this. The thought gave him a pang of melancholy, a reminder of how quickly time passed, how precious these moments were. I'll be right back, he murmured. He carried Emma to her room, tucking her into bed with practiced ease. Finch the finch was already on her pillow, waiting for his nightly duty as guardian against bad dreams. Jack placed him gently in the crook of her arm, then stood for a moment, watching her sleep. What was best for her? That was the question that had been driving him, guiding his decisions since the day she was born. What would give her the happiest, healthiest, most secure life? He had always thought the answer was stability, routine, the steady, predictable rhythm of their life together. But watching her with Elizabeth tonight, seeing the light in her eyes, the animation in her voice, he wondered if he had been too cautious, too afraid of change. Perhaps what she needed most was not the absence of upheaval, but the presence of joy. And Elizabeth brought joy to both of them when he returned to the kitchen. Elizabeth was washing the serving dishes he hadn't been able to fit in the dishwasher. Her back was to him, her movements efficient but gentle, careful with his things. It was such a domestic scene, so ordinary and yet so extraordinary, given who she was, what she could afford. You don't have to do that, he said, moving to stand beside her at the sink. She glanced at him, a small smile playing on her lips. I know. I want to. She handed him a dripping casserole dish. You wash, I'll dry. He took the dish and a towel, falling into an easy rhythm beside her. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the clink of dishes and the soft whoosh of the water. Thank you for tonight, Elizabeth said finally, her voice soft, for giving me a chance to explain, for letting me see Emma again. Jack nodded, focusing on drying a serving spoon. She missed you. We both did. Elizabeth's hands stilled in the soapy water. Jack, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. She turned to face him, her expression serious. Do you think we can move past this, really move past it? Because I don't want to start something. To build hopes, especially Emma's, if you don't think you can ever fully trust me again? It was the question he had been asking himself all night, the heart of the matter. He set down the spoon and towel, giving her his full attention. I don't know, he said honestly. I want to. I think I can. But it's not just about trust. Elizabeth, it's about worlds. Your world and mine. They're so different. I'm afraid. I'm afraid that one day you'll wake up and realize that this, he gestured around the small, worn kitchen, isn't enough, that I'm not enough. Oh, Jack, she whispered, her eyes suddenly bright with tears. This is what I couldn't make you understand before. This your home, your life, your work, it isn't less than my world. It's more, so much more. You've built something real here, something with heart and soul and purpose. I have a name, I have money, but until I met you, I didn't have a life, not a real one. She stepped closer, her soapy hands leaving damp spots on his shirt as she gripped his arms. I'm not slumming. Jack, I'm not playing house. I'm trying to find my way back to something authentic, something meaningful. And I found it here, with you, with Emma. Jack looked down at her, at the earnestness in her eyes, the vulnerability, the hope. He had been so wrong about her, had let his own insecurities color his perception of her intentions. She wasn't Elizabeth Morgan slumming with the carpenter. She was just Elizabeth, trying to find her place in the world, just like him. I believe you, he said softly, and he found that he did, completely. And yes, I think we can move past this. I think we already have. The smile that broke across her face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds, brilliant and warm and full of promise. She stood on tiptoe and pressed a soft, tentative kiss to his cheek. A question, an invitation. Jack answered by turning his head slightly, catching her lips with his own. The kiss was gentle at first, a careful exploration, then deeper, more certain. Her hands slid up to his shoulders, leaving damp handprints on his shirt. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer when they finally broke apart, both a little breathless. Elizabeth leaned her forehead against his chest, a soft laugh escaping her. What? Jack asked, smiling down at her. Nothing, she said, looking up at him with sparkling eyes. It's just, I'm standing in a kitchen with soap bubbles up to my elbows, being kissed by a man who makes birds out of wood. It's not exactly how the society pages would picture Elizabeth Morgan spending her evening. Disappointed, he teased, though there was a flicker of genuine question beneath the humor. Are you kidding? She grinned, radiant with happiness. It's the best evening I've had in years. As if to prove her point, she kissed him again, a quick, playful peck that left him wanting more. Then she turned back to the sink, bumping him gently with her hip. Now, back to work. These dishes won't dry themselves. The next few weeks unfolded like the pages of a storybook, each day bringing Jack and Elizabeth closer, each moment deepening their understanding of each other's worlds. Elizabeth extended her stay in Mapleton, working remotely, shuttling back to the city only for the most essential meetings. She rented a small cottage on the edge of town, a charming space with a view of the woods and a small studio where she could sketch. She began to integrate Jack into her professional life, inviting him to video conferences with the Heritage Hands Foundation Board, seeking his input on grants for artisans, bringing him into the planning for the gallery, and he, in turn, welcomed her deeper into his world, teaching her the basics of woodworking, introducing her to his small circle of friends, making space for her in the daily rhythms of his and Emma's life. It wasn't always smooth. There were moments of cultural collision, of misunderstanding, of adjustment. Elizabeth would forget that not everyone could drop everything for a spontaneous weekend trip. Jack would bristle at the casual way she spoke of sums that would take him months to earn. But they were learning, adapting, finding a middle ground where both could stand comfortably. One crisp autumn evening, as they walked through the town square, hands intertwined, Elizabeth stopped in front of a vacant storefront. It was an old, charming building with large display windows and intricate brickwork, nestled between a bookshop and a cafe. What do you think? She asked, gesturing to the space. For the gallery, Jack looked at the building with a critical eye. It was well situated, centrally located, with good natural light and ample space, but it was also in need of significant renovation, the interior visible through the dusty windows, showing water damage and outdated fixtures. It has potential, he said cautiously, but it needs a lot of work, structural work, not just cosmetic. Elizabeth nodded, her eyes alight with possibility. I know, that's part of what I love about it. We could restore it, bring back its original character. Make it a showcase not just for the art inside, but for traditional craftsmanship in the renovation itself. Local stonework, custom woodwork, Hand-forged hardware. Jack smiled, caught up in her enthusiasm despite his practical reservations. You've given this a lot of thought. I have, she admitted. I've actually had my eye on this building for a couple of weeks. I wanted to get your opinion before making an offer. An offer? You're serious about this? Of course I am, she said, surprised by his surprise. Jack, the Heritage Hands Gallery isn't just a concept or a philanthropic gesture. It's happening, and I want you to be part of it, not just as an exhibitor, but as a partner, a co-director. Jack stared at her, momentarily speechless. Elizabeth, I don't know anything about running a gallery. I'm a carpenter, not a curator or a businessman. You know beauty, she countered. You know craftsmanship. You know what it means to create something with your hands, to pour your soul into your work. That's what this gallery's about, the business side. The logistics, I can handle that, but the heart of it, the vision, that's you. Jack, that's always been you. He looked at the building again, trying to see it through her eyes. Not just a storefront, but a showcase. A place where craftsmen like him could display their work with dignity, where children could learn traditional skills, where art and community could intersect. It was a beautiful vision, a meaningful one. What about your other work, he asked. Morgan Global, the board, James Parker. A shadow crossed Elizabeth's face at the mention of Parker. It's, complicated, she admitted. Parker's still there, still trying to undermine me. But I have allies now. Harry's been invaluable, and the Heritage Hands Foundation is gaining support. Not just from the board, but from the public. People are responding to the mission, to the idea of preserving traditional crafts. She squeezed his hand, her expression earnest. I'm not abandoning my responsibilities. Jack, I'm redefining them, finding a way to honor my family's legacy while creating something new, something meaningful. And I want to do it with you. Jack looked down at their intertwined hands, his calloused and worn, hers slender and elegant, different, but fitting together perfectly, like their lives, like their worlds. All right, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. Let's do it. Let's make this happen. The joy that lit up her face was worth any risk, any uncertainty. She threw her arms around his neck, laughing, and he lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace, spinning her around right there on the sidewalk, not caring who might see, as he set her down. A thought occurred to him. What should we call it? The gallery? Elizabeth smiled, her eyes twinkling with a secret. I was thinking, Heritage Hands. Simple, direct, honoring the past while creating the future. Jack nodded, liking the sound of it. Heritage Hands it is. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The purchase of the building, the renovations, the planning for the gallery's opening, all of it consumed Jack and Elizabeth's time and energy. But it was a joyful busyness, a shared purpose that brought them closer with each passing day. Jack oversaw the renovation, working alongside local craftsmen to restore the building's original features, while adding modern amenities. Elizabeth handled the legal and financial aspects, shuttling between Mapleton and the city, gradually spending more and more time in the small town. Emma was their enthusiastic assistant, offering crayon-drawn design suggestions, helping to organize the growing collection of artisan submissions, charming potential donors with her earnest excitement about the project. She blossomed in the presence of their shared mission, her natural creativity finding new outlets, her confidence growing daily. They faced challenges, of course. James Parker continued his campaign against Elizabeth at Morgan Global, using the Heritage Hands project as evidence of her divided loyalties and emotional decision-making. There were moments of tension between Jack and Elizabeth as they navigated the integration of their lives, the balance of power and independence. There were practical obstacles in the renovation, unexpected costs, delays, the thousand small complications that come with any major undertaking. But through it all, they persevered, together, building something that was greater than the sum of its parts. A gallery, a relationship, a future. 3 days before the grand opening of Heritage Hands Gallery, Jack found himself alone in the nearly finished space. Elizabeth had taken Emma to the city for a special shopping trip. She needs a proper dress for the opening. Jack, it's her gallery too. And he had used the opportunity to put the finishing touches on a surprise. The main exhibition space was ready. The walls painted a warm cream that provided a perfect backdrop for the artwork. The floors restored to their original hardwood glory. The lighting designed to showcase each piece to its best advantage. The collection was impressive wooden sculptures, hand-woven textiles, forged metalwork, pottery, all created by local and regional artisans, many of whom had never exhibited their work before. But it was the central installation that Jack was focused on now, a large circular platform in the middle of the main gallery, currently hidden under a drop cloth. It was the showcase piece, the heart of the exhibition, and it was his gift to Elizabeth. He lifted the cloth carefully, revealing his creation. It was a tree, life-sized, carved from a single massive oak that had fallen in a storm last winter. The trunk rose from the platform, splitting into branches that spread across the ceiling, each one supporting a collection of wooden birds in flight. There were dozens of them, each one unique, each one caught in a moment of joyous movement, and at the center of the flock, two birds flew wing to wing, a finch and a sparrow. Jack stood back, examining his work with a critical eye. It had taken him months, working in secret during the evenings after Elizabeth had gone back to her cottage, hiding the pieces in a locked storage room whenever she visited the gallery. It was the most ambitious piece he had ever created, both technically challenging and emotionally significant. He was so absorbed in his inspection that he didn't hear the gallery door open, didn't notice Elizabeth's presence until she gasped. "Jack," she breathed, her voice filled with wonder. "What is this?" He turned, startled, to find her standing at the entrance to the exhibition space, alone, her eyes wide as she took in the installation. "It was supposed to be a surprise," he said, a bit chagrined. "For the opening, it's incredible," she said.